So questions are most appreciated, interruptions most valued. Let's see where this talk takes us. So Tridger's going to start by letting us know a little bit about the things that have gone on in the last little while about trying to make a release of samba4.
Okay, thanks Andrew. Is this working?
Hello.
Yes, excellent, it works. So you may have seen some things in various reputable and disreputable news sources, you know, I won't say which is in which category, John, about the release of samba4. And the interesting thing that's happened in the last year is that we've gone from you know, samba4 being some way off, we'll say, you know, when it's ready sort of thing, to proposing we'd like to release it now. And, you know, are there any objections? And Andrew made that proposal out on a public mailing list. It's actually a discussion that we would often have internally within the Samba team. And the discussion instead was held, you know, on a public mailing list, and so a whole lot of other people chimed in. It was all rather exciting, really. How many of you followed that debate about the samba4 release? A few in the audience read John's article about it, and I think your readership's down, John. Okay, so basically what happened was Andrew and I were thinking that, well, we think we're basically ready, and we think that the Active Directory side of samba4 is doing really well. It's being used in production at quite a few sites around the world, so why not make it official and do a release? And the way Andrew put it is, you know, let's put it out as is rather than trying to perfect it, you know, wait for everything to be perfect, because there's always another bug, there's always another thing that you can do. And I think it came as a bit of a shock to some people on the team who sort of always thought of samba4 as being off in the distance, and to suddenly be confronted with, well, should we release it next week, was a little bit of a shock. And that led to perhaps a more animated debate about the release than one would really hope. And the main points of discussion about the release were not about the Active Directory features, which is the part that Andrew and I and Kai and Amitay. Amitay, put your hand up. Yep, Amitay is a new samba4 developer in the last year, so welcome Amitay to Samba development. So all the features we've been working on, the Active Directory features, being a domain controller, being a subdomain member, all these sort of things, that stuff, everyone seems to be agreed, looking good. What we're missing is some of the features that what is Samba is known as the bread and butter of Samba for the last 20 years, because it has been, this year, it's 20 years since Samba started. In December, there was the 20th anniversary. Anyway, those features, for example, samba4 had a new file server implementation, right? And Samba's bread and butter has been file serving, for, you know, ever since it started 20 years ago. And the new file server implementation was hadn't kept up with some of the features and the development that had gone on in the samba3 file server. And so we had a plan to release to integrate the samba3 file server more tightly with the samba4 server. And we hadn't achieved that. We thought, well, actually, it's all quite usable now, as our production sites demonstrate. Why don't we release it and then do, you know, a 4.1 or whatever that has that final goal? And there were members of the team who thought, no, we can't do that, it will cause too much confusion, etc. And so what we're doing now is we're now trying to finish off that last piece, and we've come up with a technical mechanism for integrating the samba3 file server more tightly into the samba4 server on a much more accelerated timescale. And it's the usual thing, you know, for geeks, when you hit a sort of a social problem, disagreement about something, find a technical solution, because it's easier to code than to argue. And that's basically what the result, that's why it's gone quiet now, and it's not because we've all gone off in a huff in our corners, it's because myself and others have gone off into a corner to code and to provide that technical solution, and once we present that technical solution, we're expecting the debate to start up again, and it won't be such a shock this time, we hope, to some other members of the team, and we hope then the release will happen. Meanwhile, you can be quite happy that we think that the Active Directory portions are ready to be used, because we actually think that, you know, it should be out there being used, so you can have some confidence in the code base now. Great. Andrew.
Thank you. So, yeah, as Tridge was saying, we now have a single Samba. We still have some different ways of using it. There is the SMBD that Samba3's always had, and the Samba that the Samba4 process has built. But it's now one build system. There is now just one way you build all of Samba together. There is, and that's giving us incredible things. We've got, I'll talk a bit later about some of the testing and things that's allowing. We're also integrating in between the two bits of these two parts of the project. We have plugins where one plugs into the other to allow the extra features that we need. And this is bringing together, rather than being really two separate projects within one source code tree, we've worked really hard to make it one project. You know, there's a lot to go, and there's still people's feelings as to which part of the project they work on. But we're really trying to cross those, make those bridges between the different parts of the project, and so that we can really be one Samba going forward. Combined testing has been the most important thing that we've achieved. By having a single build system, you can run a single make, produce all of the Samba binaries, and then you can have a single make test that tests all of the Samba binaries, not just Samba3 against Samba3, Samba4 against Samba4, but do they join each other? We did actually have times when they wouldn't, and that's rather embarrassing. So, having those tests, it also just means that we've got real Active Directory testing. And Samba3 couldn't actually test the Active Directory domain member capabilities, critical stuff for us to have working, but we just didn't have a way of automatically testing it all the time. And as we now have procedures for doing automated testing before every single commit, it was really important that we automatically test some of our most important features. Got a question up the back? No, just someone muttering. We also have a common security subsystem. This is my passion, is in these areas of how we authenticate Samba, how we authenticate our users to Samba. And so I spent a lot of effort going and making two structures which were doing the same job into different parts of the code base, be the same structure in the whole code base, because otherwise you can't then run the same helper functions. So we did a lot of work on that. I'll slowly undoing some of the poor decisions that we made 10 years ago, where we misunderstood the security architecture of Kerberos. We also had 10 years poorer tools and libraries. Some of the things we probably couldn't have got right back then. But we've now gone and said, okay, the world has advanced, we know what we're doing better, and so we're going to actually try and do these things properly. So we're now slowly merging together Samba4 security architecture into Samba3, plugging together, making sure the behaviour doesn't change too much, but having one way of handling it. And this is something that will help bring Samba together as a mature project even more. But that's all make work. It didn't, Samba4 isn't any better for that, except that, all this lovely feeling of we're all togetherness. So we have actually been doing some feature stuff, and Tridge will probably talk a little bit about the subdomain support that we got done in a big week in September.
Great. So, coming on again? Yes. So how many of you run Active Directory domains in your organisations? Right, most of you. I'd be curious, out of those numbers, put up your hand again if you have more than one domain in a forest. So you actually have a more complex domain hierarchy. Okay, probably 1 in 4, 1 in 5 maybe, that sort of number. Interesting, yeah. So Samba4 until last September supported being a domain controller, a replicating domain controller, or even a read-only domain controller within a one domain forest. But quite a number of organisations have a more complex arrangement. As we saw in this audience, it's reliable statistics. 25% of the world's forests have more than one domain. You can quote me on that. So we care about those 25% as well, and we want to make sure that if Samba4 is a domain controller in a forest like that, that we interoperate correctly. And we always knew this was coming. This was one of these things that we'd put off for years because it was not important for basic testing and our first few users, but we knew it was important in larger organisations and in enterprise organisations, as you might say. So we put a lot of effort in, but largely the effort was centring around a couple of key pieces. One of them was finding all the places where we assumed that the name of the forest was the same as the name of the domain, which isn't necessarily the same. Typically, your the subdomains are related to sub-DNS domains, and you might have samba.example.com, then hackers.samba.example.com as a subdomain of samba.example.com. So we spent a lot of time around July, August, September last year working on that feature, testing it, making sure that we got the basic code going. The reason for that, the focus of that time, is September each year is the time when we have the Plug Fest with Microsoft. And we'll be talking a bit more about our relationship with Microsoft later in the presentation. But basically, once a year, a whole bunch of Samba developers, we had 10 or so, 10, 12, how many did we have last September? Did we?
About 8 of us, I think.
8 of us, okay. 8 or so Samba developers, and a similar, maybe slightly bigger number. Were we outnumbered?
Yes, I think we're easily outnumbered.
Outnumbered.
Probably the testing people.
Oh, okay, yes, that makes us outnumbered very quickly. So they then bring in their engineers who've flown in from all over the world, and we have a week in Redmond in a room, allowed out for meals and sleeping occasionally, or they actually bring meals in. So in that week we work directly with their engineers to solve problems, and each year we have a particular focus. And we thought, we usually have like a stretch goal. We think something that is important that we don't have yet. So the previous year it had been read-only domain controller support, right? And there's some quite interesting issues being a read-only domain controller. So this last September we decided that the stretch goal we would have would be to support subdomains, both Microsoft domain controllers being subdomain controllers of a Samba forest, Samba initiated forest, and the reverse, where you have Samba domain controllers being DCs of a subdomain of a Microsoft forest, or any mixture thereof. We got it barely working just before the Plug Fest, and then during the week of the Plug Fest ironed out a lot of the bugs and were able to demonstrate it working, which was fantastic. And these sort of very intensive hacking sessions where you sit in a room for a week are extremely effective. And this last one, unfortunately, due to illness, I wasn't actually able to attend, so I attended remotely. And Andrew took a microphone, and then we had VNC links and the Mumble voice. Everyone here, you know what Mumble is? Great, like IRC for voice, fantastic system. We were using that to basically audibly link the room up in Redmond with my study back in Australia. And then I was getting up on a schedule of sort of 3 or 4 in the morning to match the Redmond time. And it worked surprisingly well. I'd done that for Andrew the previous year because he had excuse of his wife had just had a baby and didn't think the idea of him running off to Redmond for a week, leaving her literally with the baby, would be great. So that worked really well, and at the end of the week we had pretty good subdomain support. We still classify it as experimental. There are some edge cases that we're still dealing with, but we're really quite happy with it, and we'd like to see a couple of brave production sites try subdomains and to see how it goes in production, before we sort of say, yeah, we think it's definitely production ready.
Another thing that Amitai and I have worked on in the last little bit is Samba3 upgrade. So it's really important. You've got a Samba3 production site. Well, how are you going to get to Samba4? Wipe it all and ask users for new passwords isn't very popular amongst my system administrator friends. So Amitai and I banded together on linking up. It was one of the real benefits of the combined build system, actually, because we actually had in one system all the code from Samba3, which could read Samba3 databases really well, with Samba4, which then could write into its database. So we wrote, it was actually done in Python, and we wrote a Python bindings for Samba3's database layer, and we're then able to easily import that into Samba4, and that worked out pretty well. We import all the user IDs correctly, so a number of sites have actually tried that, and it seems to be working for them. We're going to improve it more. It seems that most people when they're upgrading, they tend to go from one old piece of hardware that's about to fall over onto their new piece of newly purchased hardware. And that wasn't the use case I was originally thinking. So I'm going to do some more work so that it's easier just to copy a few files across. But that's, and to the clients, that's the thing. For a Windows client, it's just as if you upgraded NT4 into Active Directory. They just say, oh, it's now Active Directory, and they go on with life, which is exactly what we're looking at. There's no rejoining of machines, which was one of the important things.
So it is a one-time import?
It's a one-time import. You can't go back. Windows machines have a bit of logic. They stop supporting NT4 system policies as soon as they've seen Active Directory.
So there's no backup plan?
No, well, you'd have to rejoin the machines. I recommend people who are playing with this is to take a copy of their domain and to take a laptop or a desktop that's spare in a pool or whatever, put it on a separate network and then play with those and keep upgrading and testing until you're happy, and then do it once for real, or just move that machine back as being the real DC. And people have done that. It's worked quite well for them. Amity, anything else you want to say on that? Okay. Now my two colleagues on the right here know a lot about DNS. Between the two of them, they've been working rather hard on getting Samba some DNS. So Amity has been working on Bind 9 DLZ, and Kai has been working on the internal DNS server. So do you guys want to say a couple of words about DNS?
In the AD world, the DNS is supported as the Active Directory record. So all the DNS information is actually stored in the Active Directory. Now, before we actually went that far to support DNS in Active Directory, we wanted a quick fix way to get DNS up and running very easily, so that we don't have to rewrite a whole DNS application just for Samba. So one of the things was to use existing DNS server, which is Bind, and then see whether we can extend it so that it, instead of using its own flat files, whether it can use our flat files, and see whether that works. So when that worked, then we said, okay, can we extend it even further to use directly our database rather than using flat files? So the Bind 9 DLZ stands for Dynamically Loadable Zones. It's basically a plugin in Bind, which is the DNS server, which allows you to open Samba's Active Directory database and then read the records, all the DNS records of it, so that you have a DNS server which uses Active Directory as the backend database. Now, so Bind 9 is actually a separate process. It's not related to Samba. So we have a sort of a dependency, so that Samba has to be, so you have to create the Active Directory database and then make sure that your Bind configuration refers to that Active Directory database, and so it can open and then use the records from it. Now, this is a bit clunky because it still relies on two different processes, two different applications, two different code bases. So that's where Kai's work comes in, where he's actually writing a DNS server for Samba.
Yeah, so, I mean, of course, when I started with this, people were telling me, okay, there's tons of DNS server softwares out there, why don't you just use one of those? And I said, well, I have this shiny not invented here badge that I got when I joined the Samba team, so I get to reinvent the wheel if I want to. No, but honestly, I tried. I talked to a couple of the smaller DNS server developers if they were interested in getting an Active Directory backend, and all of them said, well, bugger off. I tried to talk to the Bind people, and it seems like they don't respond to emails a lot. I know Tridge has a different experience, but it seems to me that it makes a difference if you actually write from tridge@samba.org or just another email address. For some reason, there seems to be a difference. Anyway, at the Interop event we had with Microsoft 2 years ago, so when these guys were busy working on the read-only domain controller, I realized that every single one of the Microsoft engineers who were trying to set up Samba4 had to get help from Tridge to set up the system. And I figured if we had, for every Samba4 installation we wanted to have, Tridge to go there and help them set up Bind, this means it's a very good job security for Tridge, but it also means it scales very bad. And the two obvious fixes, like inventing cloning and clone a lot of tridges are ethically a bit tricky. So the other obvious fix was fix DNS. And I had a look at the protocol documentation and thought, well...
5 minutes, we better rush.
So basically I looked at the protocol documentation and thought, well, compared to SMB, how hard can it be? Turns out it's not really hard. So a week later, I had a basic DNS service going. I think was worth about 1,000 lines of code or something. Of course, built on the Samba infrastructure and having automatic parser generators for the packets and all of that. But 1 week of work was going. Last year at the Interop event, I added dynamic updates, another, 800 lines of code, another week of work, and dynamic updates are working. I only have time to work on Samba for a concentrated period, obviously, at the Interop event. So I guess the next features can only land for the next Interop event. Sorry, guys. But it turns out to work pretty well, and I hope that some people start testing it. It's now been merged into the main repository, so you can get it and provision with the internal server. And it should do pretty much everything apart from signed updates.
So we have a bit of a roadmap of where we're going from here. The idea is to get the file server stuff that we've talked about before integrated. I really do think samba4 will be our next release. I think we've really come to technical solutions for the things that people outlined as reasons why it shouldn't be. So it's, we're steaming along. A lot of good technical work has been done, so, we'll release samba4. It will still have an NT4 like DC in there because there are people running against things like the LDAP backend, where they have other LDAP services integrated. They may need that existing code that still works that way. But, it's going to be a combined release and people will be able to run the best of all of Samba. We've got management tools that are really improved. Our net command has become Samba tool, so as not to conflict with the net in Samba3, but also it's a really decent tool for managing Samba services, particularly Samba4 services. This last, we've basically been doing a lot of work. So 8,000 commits, 800,000 lines of code change, 70 authors. It's been a busy year. Not as busy as last year, though all the statistics are down, but it has been a busy and important year. People before were asking us about Microsoft, and as has been said, we have this great Interop week with Microsoft, and we have through the year a great ability to email them with any sort of questions we've got, and then be able to get answers back fairly quickly. We've even had them digging into the code, into the Microsoft archives, trying to find out how crazy things have occurred in the protocol to document them. Things we sort of knew about, but we actually found, it's not actually in the docs. Well, why don't we make them tell us the real story? And questions? Question from the front.
Are they, what are those Microsoft people doing? Are they just digging through Microsoft code to answer questions, or what are they doing?
A lot more than that. One of the things we've been really pleasantly surprised at is the quality of engineers they've put to help us. And in particular, they've got some fantastic debugging tools that they use. So very often if we provide a test case, they reproduce the test case themselves. And we may give them something like what's called a time travel debug trace, which allows them to bring up a source level debugger on the Windows source code and actually run the debugger backwards through time from the error case back to the packet that caused it, and able to give us a really detailed report on the exact conditions under which that error will occur. So that's the level of technical support and the level of expertise available from their engineers.
That tool sounds handy.
Yes, I would kill to have time travel debugger on Linux. If somebody wishes to implement an equivalent tool, I'm happy to tell you, the wonderful things that it does. The closest that we've got is there was a variant like this for Valgrind, based on the Valgrind core, but it's not nearly as practical, unfortunately, as a real application, whereas time travel debugger is one of the more impressive things to come out of Microsoft research. It's a great tool. So we were rushing to the end to make sure we had time for questions, expecting some, and now you're disappointing. Question?
In terms of migrating from Samba3 to Samba4, is configuration very different?
Configuration is very similar, in fact, largely due to a lot of effort that Andrew has been putting in lately to make it as similar as possible. There are some minor differences, but the aim is that your existing samba4 will work. If you want Active Directory features, you've got to turn them on in that config, just like you'd expect to. But essentially the config is extremely similar. There's a couple of minor things. At the moment, we've moved the configuration file from the lib directory to the etc directory because I made an awful mistake in the very early days by putting the configuration file in the lib directory, and we thought we might finally fix that 20 years later. But the reason was, at the time I just configured sendmail, and the sendmail configuration on my Sunbox was in lib, so I thought, obviously, this is the standard spot for configuration files. And I'm afraid all of you have lived with that ever since. So these are the sort of things we're trying to fix, and that will, you know, cause some swearing and headaches, I'm sure, but it's all in a good cause.
Question up the back.
How's printing authentication going to work when you've got printed network printers who are authenticated through AD?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow that.
I couldn't. Can you say again?
How will authentication work when?
You've got printer authentication working through AD.
Printer authentication.
Yeah, so the thing is the printers are actually listed as objects in AD.
Samba3 can be a member of, can handle AD membership for its printers, can list them. Samba4, I suspect they're listed as standard AD objects. So much of the magic of AD is actually about just shoving things into LDAP and things reading it. You don't actually have to do too much processing on the server side for many of these fancy features.
But specifically authentication, printer authentication is the same as file sharing authentication. The authentication happens before the client even says whether it's accessing a printer or accessing a file share. So really it's exactly the same. We wouldn't expect any significant differences for printer authentication, and it will just work and has worked for years. If it doesn't work, it's a bug.
Question?
Last question. You have to excuse me because I kind of came in at the end, so I hope you haven't cut this off.
It's on Samba.
I'm curious as to exactly the history around how Microsoft came to be so useful and so helpful.
There was a bit of a lawsuit in Europe. It lasted about 10 years, and basically the European Commission won. We assisted a little bit, and the end result was there's a court ruling that they need to provide documentation, but the engineers have really attacked that with relish and have been delighted about working with us.
That's what I mean. They don't seem to have come out of that obtusely. If you know what I mean.
No, they've really put a good effort in, which we've been delighted at and somewhat surprised at initially, but now we're just used to it.
Do you think that reflects a change in business model, or
I don't know. That's too philosophical. Yeah.
That's it. Okay.
Great. Thank you.